iPhone OS 1. In 2013, Jony Ive redesigned iOS and had never designed software before in his life. He was a hardware designer, the man who made the iMac, the iPod, and the iPhone's physical body. His first software product was the most controversial Apple design decision since the original iMac removed the floppy drive. The person whose software he replaced had been fired for refusing to sign an apology letter. To understand why any of that mattered, you have to start in 2007. Steve Jobs designed the original iPhone operating system around a single principle. Digital objects should behave like physical ones. A notes app should look like a yellow legal pad. A calendar should look like a desk calendar. A bookshelf should look like wood. This philosophy, called skeuomorphic design, uses real-world materials and textures to make digital interfaces feel familiar. In 2007, it was the correct decision. Touchscreens were new. Users had never interacted with software using only their fingers. The physical metaphor was not decoration, it was instruction. When your contacts app looked like a leather address book, you understood what to do with it before you touched it. The designer responsible for this direction was Scott Forstall, who reported directly to Jobs and became the most powerful software executive at Apple. iOS 6. By 2012, every Apple app was a physical object, and the craftsmanship was remarkable. Game Center displayed a green felt gambling table with wood grain edges and golden coin animations. The podcast app contained a physical reel-to-reel tape recorder that actually spooled when you pressed play. Contacts had leather binding with visible stitching. Newsstand was a wooden bookshelf. The Notes app was a yellow legal pad with a coffee-stained ring graphic at the top. iOS 6 was the peak of this era, and it is the iOS most people remember without knowing its version number. Steve Jobs died in October 2011, 1 year before iOS 6 launched. That timeline matters. In October 2012, 1 year before iOS 7 would launch, Apple fired Scott Forstall. The stated reason: he refused to sign Apple's public letter apologizing for the Maps disaster. Forstall had reportedly clashed with other Apple executives, including Jony Ive and Craig Federighi, throughout the Jobs era. Jobs had protected him. After Jobs died, the protection was gone. Forstall's refusal to sign the Maps apology letter gave the board an occasion. He was removed from his role in October 2012, officially leaving the company in 2013. He has not worked in tech since. The real consequence of his departure: Jony Ive took over all software design at Apple for the first time. The man who designed physical objects was now designing the software inside them. Scott Forstall never discussed what happened publicly. He appeared briefly at the Tony Awards in 2018. He had become a Broadway producer. The most powerful software executive at Apple, the man who built iOS from the beginning, had gone to theater. The industry was about to find out what his replacement looked like. iOS 7, the change that split the world. iOS 7 launched September 18, 2013. In one software update, every real-world texture was gone. Leather became color, felt became flat, wood grain became white space, linen became nothing, thin fonts replaced bold text, depth effects replaced physical metaphors. Every Apple app icon was redrawn from scratch. The camera icon went from a photographic lens to a flat white circle. Notes went from lined paper to a yellow rectangle. Calendar went from a physical desk calendar to a flat grid. The phone felt different to hold, even though nothing physical had changed. 3 things are less known about iOS 7 that the standard coverage misses. First, the parallax effect, where home screen icons shifted subtly as you tilted the phone, creating an illusion of depth, generated a documented wave of user complaints about motion sickness and dizziness within days of launch. Apple had to release an accessibility toggle called Reduce Motion within weeks of the update shipping. A visual feature intended to convey sophistication was making users nauseous. Second, Jony Ive had never designed software before this update. His entire career had been hardware. The man responsible for the iPhone's glass and aluminum body, for the rounded corners of the MacBook, for the translucent shell of the original iMac, was redesigning the experience inside the screen for the first time. His critics said it showed. His supporters said the industry needed it. Both were partly right. Third, iOS 7 launched the same year that Apple's services revenue, the App Store, iCloud, iTunes, began its ascent toward eventually surpassing hardware margins. The flat, modern design that removed the physical metaphors also happened to make digital purchases look less like things you were buying and more like features of a system. Whether that was deliberate has never been confirmed. iOS 8 and 9. iOS 8 added functional capability, extensions, predictive keyboard, interactive notifications, without touching the visual system. iOS 9 made one change that affected every iPhone user, and almost none of them could name. Apple replaced the Helvetica Neue typeface, the font your phone had used since 2007, with their own custom San Francisco typeface. Every piece of text on every iPhone changed in one software update. San Francisco was originally designed for Apple Watch, where readability at very small sizes was critical. Apple brought it to iPhone because the same principles applied. The change was invisible to most users in the sense that they noticed nothing had changed, but everything they read on their phone from that day forward was in a different typeface. Type designers noticed immediately. Nobody else did. That is arguably the most successful design change in iOS history. iOS 10. The iPhone lock screen had not fundamentally changed since 2007. iOS 10 rebuilt it from scratch after 9 years. Raise to Wake activated the screen when you picked up the phone, eliminating a button press that had been performed billions of times combined across all iPhone users. iMessage received its first major design update since launch. Reactions, invisible ink effects, full screen animations triggered by specific phrases. The app shifted from being a utility to being a product with personality. There is one detail about iOS 10 that illustrates how sensitive users had become to change after iOS 7. Apple replaced the swipe right to unlock gesture on the lock screen with press home to unlock. The reaction was strong enough that Apple reversed it again in iOS 11 when Face ID removed the home button entirely. One core gesture changed twice in 2 years in direct response to user pushback. The company that had spent the previous decade being accused of not listening to users made 2 consecutive gesture changes based on feedback in a 24-month window. iOS 13. Android offered system-wide dark mode in Android 9 in 2018. Apple introduced it in iOS 13 in 2019. The delay was 12 months, which tech media covered extensively at the time. What the coverage missed was the reason for the delay. iOS dark mode was not a color inversion. It was a complete second design system. Every Apple app was redesigned with dark variants. Every system element had a parallel dark version. For the system to work across every app, including third-party apps, Apple had to build a framework of semantic color variables that app developers could adopt, so their apps would automatically adjust when the user switched modes. Apps that used hard-coded colors broke. Apps that used Apple's semantic color system adapted automatically. Building that framework and waiting for enough developers to adopt it before release was what took the extra year. Android's dark mode inverted colors. Apple's dark mode changed the design system. The 12-month difference was a quality standard decision, not an inability. iOS 14. 13 years to move an icon. For 13 years, the iPhone home screen worked exactly one way. Icons filled the grid from the top left corner. You could not place a single icon at the bottom of an otherwise empty screen. You could not leave a gap. Every icon had to fill the next available position in sequence. If you downloaded 17 apps, your home screen had 17 icons arranged in order, regardless of what you wanted. iOS 14 changed this. Widgets could now be placed directly on the home screen, not just in the Today View sidebar, in sizes that replaced multiple icon slots. App Library automatically organized every app into categories and removed the requirement to display every app on the home screen. The internet response generated TikTok videos showing completely transformed iPhone home screens that collectively received hundreds of millions of views within weeks of iOS 14's release. Users who had never cared about their home screen layout began treating it as a design project. Aesthetic home screen setups became a genre of their own. Apple had given users the ability to arrange their own phone. It took 13 years. iOS 16. The lock screen becomes a canvas. iOS 16 allowed lock screen customization for the first time in iPhone history. Font choices, color themes, and widget placement below the clock were all user configurable. The depth effect introduced with iOS 16 is less discussed and more technically interesting. Lock screen photos could be set so that the subject of a portrait photograph appeared in front of the time display, with the subject rendered in front of the clock and the background behind it. The same computational photography stack used for portrait mode bokeh was repurposed for a lock screen layer effect. The subject of the photo and the interface existed in a relationship that made the screen feel physically layered. Dynamic Island launched simultaneously with iOS 16 on the iPhone 14 Pro. The hardware notch, which Apple had been defending as a design choice since 2017 while every competitor mocked it, was replaced with a pill-shaped cutout. Software transformed that cutout into a context-aware interactive element. Music controls, timers, sports scores, navigation directions, and live activities all surfaced in the space previously used only for Face ID sensors. The notch became a feature by ceasing to be a notch. iOS 18. iOS 18 allowed app icons to be placed anywhere on the home screen grid for the first time since 2007. You could leave the top of your screen empty and place 4 icons at the bottom. You could create gaps, You could cluster apps at one edge. The grid structure remained, but icons no longer had to fill it. Every Android user who had ever owned an iPhone had asked why this wasn't possible. The answer, for 17 years, had been that Apple hadn't done it. Icon tinting allowed every app icon to be colored to match a theme or the system accent color. This created visual consistency across a home screen that had previously been defined by a grid of competing colors and shapes. The features were not new to mobile operating systems. They were new to iPhone, iOS 26 and iOS 27, the first redesign since Jony Ive. At WWDC 2025, Apple announced the first major visual redesign of iOS since iOS 7 in 2013. It is called Liquid Glass. Every system interface element was rebuilt with translucent, fluid, depth-aware surfaces. Interface elements now respond to the content behind them. A notification panel over a blue background looks different from the same panel over a red background. The interface is environmentally aware in a way it has never been before. The user response divided immediately along the same lines as iOS 7 in 2013. Designers called it sophisticated. Longtime users called it hard to read. Apple shipped it, received the feedback, and did what they had done in 2013. Refined it in the following year. iOS 27, announced at WWDC 2026 on June 8th, added transparency sliders and contrast controls, giving users the ability to dial back the liquid glass effect or increase it. The same accessibility response Apple had given motion sickness sufferers with reduced motion in 2013 was given to readability concerns in 2026. The pattern is identical. iOS 27 also introduced Siri AI, a completely rebuilt version of Apple's voice assistant powered by a custom Google Gemini model for cloud-based queries. Apple pays Google approximately $1 billion a year for this arrangement. Google pays Apple approximately $20 billion a year to be the default search engine in Safari. Apple's voice assistant now runs on technology from the company that also pays to appear in Apple's browser. Apple has not highlighted this arrangement in its marketing. WWDC 2026 was Tim Cook's final WWDC as CEO. He steps down on September 1st, 2026, handing the role to hardware chief John Turnus. The last major software announcement of Cook's tenure was that Siri, the product Apple promised would change how people interacted with technology, would finally be rebuilt using someone else's AI. Whether Liquid Glass follows the iOS 7 arc, mocked first, standard later, is the only design question the industry is currently debating. iOS 7 was called a disaster and became the visual language every phone maker copied for a decade. Liquid Glass launched 1 year ago. The copying has not started yet. Apple's design changes are one list. The features they removed without replacing is a different one. Every Apple feature removed and never brought back. That video is on screen right now.